The story does not begin with what is known, but with what is missing. It opens in silence, the kind that settles between recorded lines and carefully preserved truths. History, as it is often presented, feels complete, almost polished, as if every moment has been accounted for and placed neatly into sequence. Yet beneath that surface, something quieter remains, something that does not fit so easily into the story we have been given. There are spaces where explanation thins, where the record seems to pause without reason. Entire stretches of time appear compressed, simplified, or left behind as though they no longer matter. Civilizations rise into clarity, already formed, already capable, carrying knowledge that feels unexpectedly complete. Then, just as quietly, parts of that knowledge seem to disappear, leaving behind only fragments that hint at something more. It is easy to overlook these gaps, to accept them as natural consequences of time. After all, not everything survives. Materials decay, records are lost, and memory fades. But there is a difference between what is gradually erased and what feels as though it was never fully recorded to begin with. Some absences feel less like loss and more like omission. Within ancient accounts, there are moments that resist easy interpretation. Stories of figures who arrive without origin, who offer knowledge that seems far ahead of its time, and who depart without explanation. They appear briefly, leaving behind changes that ripple outward, altering the direction of entire cultures. Then they are gone, their presence preserved only in symbols, stories, and quiet references that are often dismissed as myth. The question is not whether these accounts are true in a literal sense, but why they exist at all, and why they appear so consistently across places that never touched. When similar patterns emerge in distant regions, separated by oceans and time, it becomes harder to see them as coincidence alone. Something about these stories lingers, not as proof, but as a quiet suggestion that something may be missing from the way history is told. The deeper one looks, the more the absence itself begins to feel like a presence. Not something visible, not something that can be held, but something that shapes the outline of everything around it. The record is not empty, but incomplete, in a way that draws attention rather than dismisses it. It invites a different kind of observation, one that listens as much to what is absent as to what remains. And in that quiet space, a possibility begins to form, slowly, without urgency. Perhaps what we call complete knowledge is only a surface, a carefully arranged layer that hides deeper complexity. Perhaps the most significant moments were never meant to be preserved in clear detail, or were understood in ways that could not be easily recorded. The thought does not demand belief, only attention. It settles gently, asking nothing more than a shift in perspective. What if the most important part of human history was never written down? Not because it was forgotten, but because it existed in a form that could not be fully captured. As this question lingers, the silence no longer feels empty. It feels active, as though something waits within it, just beyond reach. And it is here that the story begins to shift, moving away from what is missing toward what remains, toward the fragments that survived and the stories that were not meant to be taken simply as stories, but as something closer to memory. They linger at the edge of understanding, not demanding acceptance, only consideration. In their quiet persistence, they invite the mind to remain open, to move slowly through uncertainty without the need for immediate answers. And as attention settles on these fragments, the sense of something unfinished becomes harder to ignore, as though the past is not closed, but quietly waiting to be seen again, in a different way. The story now shifts, not toward evidence carved in stone, but toward something far less certain and far more persistent. It moves into the realm of ancient stories, the ones often set aside, simplified, or quietly labeled as myth. Yet these stories have endured in a way that facts alone rarely do. They have traveled across generations, carried not by certainty, but by repetition. Across distant lands, separated by oceans and time, similar narratives begin to appear. In early Mesopotamia, there are accounts of beings who descended from the sky, bringing knowledge that reshaped society. In parts of Mesoamerica, there are stories of figures who arrived from above, teaching, guiding, and then leaving as suddenly as they came. In regions that never touched, never exchanged language or culture, the same pattern repeats with subtle variations, as if remembered through different lenses. At first, these accounts seem easy to explain. Ancient people, it is often said, used imagination to understand the unknown. They described natural forces as gods and unfamiliar ideas as divine gifts. This explanation feels comfortable, familiar, and complete. But the more closely these stories are examined, the more their consistency begins to feel difficult to dismiss. Why do they describe arrival from the sky so specifically? Why do they emphasize knowledge being given rather than discovered? And perhaps most quietly unsettling, why do these figures always leave, never staying long enough to become part of the world they altered? These details linger in the background, often overlooked because they do not fit neatly into the categories we have created. Modern thinking tends to separate myth from reality, placing ancient narratives into symbolic frameworks. But this separation may say more about current assumptions than about the past itself. It assumes that early humans lacked the ability to describe real experiences, that everything unfamiliar must have been imagined rather than observed. Yet, there is another possibility, one that does not claim certainty, but invites reconsideration. What if these stories were not invented, but interpreted? What if something unfamiliar was experienced, something beyond the language of the time, and what remains are descriptions shaped by limited understanding? In that case, what appears as myth may be something closer to memory, softened and reshaped across generations. The repetition becomes harder to ignore. The same themes echo across continents, not identical, but aligned in ways that feel deliberate rather than accidental. Skyborne figures, sudden knowledge, brief presence, quiet departure. Each element appears again and again, like fragments of a larger pattern that was never fully preserved. It is not necessary to accept these stories as literal truth to feel their weight. Their persistence alone suggests that they carried meaning beyond simple imagination. Stories fade when they no longer resonate. Yet these have remained, woven into the foundations of multiple cultures, surviving even as the societies that created them changed or disappeared. And still, they are often dismissed, reduced to symbols or metaphors, placed safely within the boundaries of fiction. It is a comfortable position, one that avoids uncertainty. But comfort does not always align with accuracy. Sometimes, what is dismissed too quickly holds the most difficult questions. The deeper one listens, the more these stories begin to feel less like isolated tales and more like echoes. Not clear enough to define, not strong enough to confirm, but present in a way that resists complete dismissal. They do not demand belief, they simply remain, waiting to be considered from a different angle. Why did civilizations separated by vast distances tell the same impossible story? The question settles quietly, without urgency, but with a kind of persistence that does not fade. It does not push for an answer, only for attention. And as these patterns begin to take shape, as the similarities become more difficult to ignore, another question begins to emerge, slower and deeper. If something did happen, if these stories reflect even a fragment of a shared experience, then why is there nothing left behind to confirm it? The question now settles into its most direct form, quiet but unavoidable. If something once visited, if those stories carry even a fragment of truth, then where is the evidence? It feels like a simple expectation. Evidence should remain. It should be visible, measurable, undeniable. And yet, when the search turns toward the physical world, it meets a silence that seems almost complete. At first, this silence appears to resolve the mystery. No remains, no artifacts, no clear trace. It suggests that nothing was ever there. But this conclusion depends on an assumption that is rarely examined, the assumption that evidence must survive. Time does not preserve, it erases. Stone fractures, metal corrodes, organic matter disappears entirely. Entire cities vanish beneath layers of earth. Oceans shift their boundaries, and landscapes transform until what once existed can no longer be recognized. Even the most enduring structures eventually become fragments, and those fragments become dust. What survives is not everything, but only what happens to endure under very specific conditions. When this is considered, the absence of evidence begins to feel less certain. It is no longer a definitive statement, but a possibility shaped by time itself. The past is not a stable archive. It is a process of continuous loss, where only a fraction of what existed remains accessible. And yet, there is another layer to consider, one that moves beyond natural decay. What if whatever occurred was never meant to leave a lasting physical trace? The expectation of discovery assumes that any presence would be obvious, that it would leave behind objects, structures, or unmistakable signs. But this expectation is shaped by human behavior, by the way civilizations tend to expand, build, and leave marks behind. A different kind of presence would leave something else entirely. If an encounter were brief, controlled, or limited in scope, it might not produce the kind of evidence we expect. It might influence without constructing, interact without remaining, and depart without leaving behind anything easily identifiable. In such a case, the absence of artifacts would not indicate absence of activity, only absence of permanence. The idea settles slowly, almost quietly. Evidence does not need to be dramatic to exist. It does not need to be physical in the way we anticipate. It can take other forms, less obvious, less direct, and far more difficult to recognize. This shifts the question itself. Instead of asking where the objects are, attention begins to move toward what changed, what shifted in ways that cannot be easily explained, what developments appear without clear origin, what patterns emerge without a visible cause. These are not pieces of evidence in the traditional sense, but they are traces, subtle, indirect, and easily overlooked. The search becomes less about finding something solid and more about noticing something intangible. It becomes an exercise in perception, in recognizing effects rather than origins. And this is where the uncertainty deepens, because effects can exist without revealing their source. What if the reason we haven't found proof is because it was never meant to be found? The question no longer feels like doubt. It feels like a quiet adjustment, a shift in how the search itself is understood. The expectation of clear, physical evidence begins to fade, replaced by something more complex, something less defined. And as this perspective takes hold, the absence that once seemed like an answer begins to feel like an opening. Not empty, not final, but leading somewhere less obvious. Because if physical traces are uncertain, if objects and artifacts cannot carry the full story, then the possibility emerges that the true imprint of such a presence may not exist in the ground or in ruins, but somewhere far less visible, woven into the development of humanity itself. The story begins to shift, moving away from what is missing and towards something that feels almost too present. Not absence, but acceleration. Not silence, but sudden clarity. Across different points in early human history, there are moments where progress does not appear to unfold slowly, but instead arrives with a kind of completeness that feels unexpected. Agriculture appears, not as a scattered experiment, but as a structured system. The understanding of seasons, planting cycles, and land management seems to emerge with a level of precision that suggests long familiarity rather than early discovery. Communities that once moved with the rhythms of survival begin to settle, to organize, to cultivate the land in ways that reflect knowledge already formed. In another part of the world, attention turns upward. The sky, vast and distant, becomes something measured and understood. Movements of stars are tracked, patterns are recorded, and time itself begins to take shape through observation. The complexity of these systems suggests not just curiosity, but comprehension, an awareness of cycles that extend far beyond immediate human experience. Mathematics follows a similar path. Numbers are not simply counted, they are structured, organized into systems that allow for prediction, construction, and design. Geometry appears with a level of sophistication that seems less like invention and more like recognition, as though the principles were discovered already waiting to be understood. And then there are the structures, massive, precise, aligned with celestial events in ways that require not only skill, but deep knowledge. These are not tentative attempts. They do not feel like the early stages of learning. They stand with confidence, as though built upon an understanding that had already reached maturity. It is not that human intelligence is in question. The capacity for innovation has always been present. But the timing of these developments invites a quieter kind of curiosity. Why do these advancements appear in clusters, as if triggered rather than slowly accumulated? Why do they often emerge in forms that feel complete from the beginning, rather than evolving through visible stages? The traditional explanation speaks of gradual progress, of small discoveries building upon one another over time. And in many ways, this is true. But within that gradual story, there are moments that feel different, moments where the pace shifts, where understanding seems to arrive more quickly than expected. These moments do not prove anything on their own. They do not demand a new explanation, but they do invite a different kind of attention, one that looks not just at what was achieved, but how it appeared. There is a possibility, quiet and uncertain, that these leaps were not entirely isolated. That early humans, standing at the edge of understanding, may have encountered influences that guided rather than replaced their own abilities. Not instruction in the way we imagine it today, but something more subtle. A nudge, a suggestion, a glimpse of what was possible. Such an influence would not erase human achievement. It would exist within it, woven into the process in a way that becomes indistinguishable from natural development. Over time, the origin of that influence would fade, leaving only the result. The thought does not need to be accepted. It only needs to be considered. How did ancient humans learn so much, so quickly? The question lingers without pressure, without urgency. It does not reject the known explanations, but it allows space for something more, something that may exist just beyond what is easily measured. And as this possibility begins to settle, as the idea of sudden knowledge becomes harder to ignore, attention begins to move once again, not toward abstract understanding, but toward something tangible. Because if knowledge appeared with such clarity, then perhaps it left behind more than ideas. Perhaps it was expressed in form, in structure, in creations that still remain, waiting to be seen not just as achievements, but as clues. The story moves from knowledge into form, from ideas into stone. Across the world, there are structures that do not simply stand as remnants of the past, but as quiet questions that have never fully settled. They rise from deserts, forests, and mountains, shaped with a precision that feels almost out of place in the time they are said to belong to. The pyramids are often the first to come to mind, massive, symmetrical, aligned with a degree of accuracy that continues to be studied. Their construction suggests planning, coordination, and understanding that extend far beyond basic survival. The angles are exact, the orientation deliberate, and the scale itself raises a question that remains difficult to answer with certainty. But they are not alone. Across distant landscapes, enormous stones are positioned with care, some weighing more than modern machinery would comfortably move. They are stacked, balanced, and fitted together so tightly that even now, gaps are nearly impossible to find. In some places, the surfaces are shaped with such smoothness that it becomes difficult to imagine the tools that created them. In others, entire sites align with celestial events, marking solstices and equinoxes with a precision that suggests deep familiarity with the movements of the sky. These structures are often explained through determination, through the idea that time and effort alone can account for their existence. And in many ways, that explanation carries truth. Human beings are capable of extraordinary achievement when driven by purpose. Yet there remains a quiet tension between what is possible and what appears to have been accomplished. The question is not whether these structures were built by human hands, but how those hands were guided. What knowledge shaped the process? What understanding allowed such precision to emerge without the tools we rely on today? And perhaps most quietly, how did that knowledge appear when it did? There are suggestions that techniques have been lost, that methods once understood no longer exist in their original form. This possibility offers a kind of comfort, a way to bridge the gap between past and present. But even this idea raises its own questions. Knowledge tends to evolve, to expand, to build upon itself. It rarely disappears entirely without leaving traces behind. And yet, in these structures, there is a sense of completeness that feels difficult to trace back through gradual development. They do not always appear as the result of slow progression. Instead, they seem to arrive fully realized, as though the understanding behind them had already reached a level of refinement before being expressed. This does not point to a single explanation. It does not require one, but it does invite a shift in perspective, a willingness to consider that the story may be more layered than it appears. What if these structures were not just built, but guided? The thought settles gently, without urgency. It does not replace existing explanations, but it expands them, allowing space for the possibility that influence can exist without being visible. Guidance does not need to be direct. It can take the form of inspiration, of shared insight, of something introduced at just the right moment to alter the direction of development. If such influence existed, it would not necessarily leave behind clear evidence of its origin. It would exist within the result, within the structure itself, indistinguishable from the work of those who carried it out. Over time, the source would fade, leaving only the achievement. And so the structures remain, not as answers, but as questions shaped in stone. They stand quietly, unchanged by interpretation, waiting to be understood in ways that may still be unfolding. As attention lingers on their precision, on their alignment, on the quiet confidence of their design, the mystery begins to shift once more. Because if knowledge could be expressed so clearly in physical form, if something unseen could shape what was built, then perhaps its trace does not end there. Perhaps it continues, not in stone, but somewhere less visible, carried not through structures, but through something far more subtle, something that does not erode with time, something that remains even when everything else is lost. The story turns inward, away from stone and sky, towards something quieter and far more difficult to measure. If no clear trace remains in the ground, if structures raise questions but do not resolve them, then the possibility emerges that what remains may not exist outside of us at all, it may exist within. Memory is often understood as something fixed, something that records events as they happened and preserves them in recognizable form. But memory does not always behave this way. It changes, it softens, it adapts to the limits of language and the passage of time. What begins as a direct experience can become something symbolic, something reshaped by generations who no longer understand its original context. Over time, memory fragments. It loses detail, but it does not disappear entirely. Instead, it settles into patterns, stories, symbols, recurring ideas that feel familiar without being fully explained. These patterns move through cultures, carried by repetition rather than accuracy, surviving not because they are understood, but because they resonate. Across distant civilizations, certain images return again and again. Figures descending from above, knowledge given rather than discovered, moments of sudden change that alter the course of human development. These elements do not remain consistent in form, but they remain consistent in presence. They shift in language, in interpretation, in meaning, yet something within them feels preserved. It is easy to see these patterns as coincidence, or as the natural result of shared human imagination. After all, the sky is universal. The unknown invites explanation. But there is a difference between creating stories and carrying them. Some ideas fade quickly, while others endure with quiet persistence, repeating across time as though anchored by something deeper. What if these patterns are not simply inventions, but echoes? The thought does not require certainty. It only suggests that memory may operate in ways that are not always recognized. That what once was experienced directly may now exist in forms that feel symbolic, not because they were always symbolic, but because that is how they survived. This possibility changes the nature of the search. Instead of looking outward for physical evidence, attention begins to shift toward perception itself, toward the way humans remember, interpret, and carry fragments of the past without realizing it. The mystery becomes less about discovering something new and more about recognizing something that has always been present, hidden in plain sight. What if the truth was never lost, only forgotten in a different form? The question lingers, not as a conclusion, but as an opening. It invites a quieter kind of awareness, one that does not demand proof, but allows recognition to unfold slowly. It suggests that understanding may not arrive through discovery alone, but through reinterpretation, through seeing familiar things in a way that reveals their deeper layers. In this space, the boundary between past and present begins to soften. Memory is no longer something that belongs only to history. It becomes something active, something that continues to shape perception even when its origin is no longer clear. And as this idea settles, the story begins to shift once more. Because if traces of something unknown can exist within human consciousness, carried quietly through time, then perhaps they are not the only traces that remain. Perhaps the Earth itself, shaped by forces that extend far beyond human awareness, still holds subtle signs of something that once arrived, left its influence, and then disappeared without leaving anything that could be easily recognized as proof. The story shifts again, moving away from memory and into something far older, far quieter, and far less influenced by human interpretation. The Earth itself becomes the focus, not as a backdrop, but as a record, a silent witness to everything that has ever occurred upon its surface. It does not forget in the way people do. It holds, compresses, and preserves, though not always in ways that are easy to read. At first, the planet appears consistent. Layers of rock form in sequences, each one representing a passage of time. Sediment settles, hardens, and becomes part of a structure that can be studied, measured, and understood. The process feels predictable, almost orderly, as though the Earth writes its history in a language that can be learned. But within that order, there are interruptions. There are formations that seem out of place, patterns that do not fully align with the processes expected to create them. In certain regions, materials appear where they should not, arranged in ways that suggest forces or influences that are not immediately clear. These are not always dramatic discoveries. Often, they are subtle, almost easy to overlook. A layer that does not match what surrounds it, a structure that appears too precise for natural formation, yet too ambiguous to confirm otherwise. In archaeology, similar questions emerge. Objects are occasionally found in contexts that challenge expectation, tools or markings that appear earlier than the timelines assigned to them, artifacts that suggest a level of understanding that does not fully align with what is believed about the people who created them. These discoveries are rarely accepted without scrutiny, and often they are reinterpreted, reassigned, or explained within existing frameworks. This process is necessary. Without it, understanding would lose its foundation. But it also reveals something important. Interpretation shapes reality. What is seen is not always what is understood, and what is understood is not always complete. There is a tendency to resolve anomalies quickly, to fit them into explanations that restore continuity. The Earth is expected to behave according to known processes, and when something appears to deviate, the explanation often moves toward restoring that expectation. Natural forces are adjusted, timelines reconsidered, conclusions refined until the pattern feels stable again. Yet not all interruptions disappear so easily. Some remain, quiet and unresolved, not strong enough to overturn established understanding, but persistent enough to remain in the background. They do not demand attention, but they do not fully fade. They exist as small fractures in an otherwise continuous story. What if these fractures matter more than they appear to? The thought emerges slowly, without urgency. It does not suggest that every anomaly is significant, or that every unexplained feature points to something beyond current understanding. But it does invite a different kind of attention, one that does not rush to resolve, but allows uncertainty to remain. What if the planet remembers, even when we don't? The question lingers within the layers, within the quiet structures that resist simple explanation. The Earth does not record intention, it does not label events or provide context. It only holds what has occurred, shaped by forces that continue long after the moment has passed. If something unfamiliar once took place, something brief or subtle, it might not appear as a clear mark. It might exist as a distortion, a slight deviation from what is expected, something that does not belong entirely to the pattern, but does not stand outside it either. And this is where the uncertainty deepens, because if such traces exist, they would not announce themselves. They would remain embedded, indistinguishable from the processes that surround them, waiting to be noticed in a way that does not yet exist. As the surface begins to feel less certain, less complete than it once seemed, attention begins to shift downward, because what is visible is only part of the story. Beneath the surface, beyond immediate reach, lie layers that hold far more than what can be seen, places where time does not erase as quickly, where what has been lost above may still remain, hidden, waiting without urgency to be uncovered. The surface of the Earth gives the impression of permanence. Mountains stand, valleys stretch, oceans hold their shape, and the land beneath our feet feels stable, as though it has always existed exactly as it is. But this stability is only an illusion, a momentary pause in a process that never truly stops. Beneath that surface, time moves differently. It does not preserve in neat layers of clarity. It compresses, distorts, and conceals. Every year, small changes take place. Dust settles, sediment gathers, ice forms and melts. These processes feel slow, almost insignificant in isolation. But over centuries and millennia, they accumulate into something far more powerful. Entire landscapes are gradually buried beneath new ones. Rivers shift their paths, carrying away what once existed and depositing it elsewhere. Forests become soil, and soil becomes stone. What remains visible is only the most recent layer, the thin surface of a much deeper history. Beneath it lies everything that came before, pressed into strata that grow denser and more difficult to reach with each passing age. These layers do not arrange themselves for easy understanding. They overlap, fold, and fracture, shaped by forces that care nothing for clarity. What we uncover through excavation is only a fragment, a narrow glimpse into a vast and largely inaccessible record. Each discovery feels significant, yet it represents only a small portion of what exists. For every structure found, countless others may remain buried beyond reach, hidden beneath layers that have yet to be disturbed. It becomes easier to imagine how entire chapters of history could disappear without truly being lost. They are not erased. They are simply moved beyond visibility, compressed into forms that no longer resemble what they once were. Over enough time, even the most distinct structures can lose their identity, breaking down into materials that blend with their surroundings. And yet, something of them remains. Not always recognizable, not always intact, but present in a way that resists complete disappearance. A pattern in the rock that suggests shaping rather than formation. A fragment that does not quite belong to the layer in which it is found. Small details that feel out of place, but not enough to stand apart without question. The deeper one considers this, the more the idea of missing evidence begins to shift. It is no longer a matter of absence, but of location. Evidence may exist, but not where we expect to find it, and not in the form we expect to recognize. How much of Earth's past is still hidden beneath our feet? The question settles slowly, expanding rather than narrowing the possibilities. It suggests that the visible world is only a surface, a thin boundary separating what is known from what remains concealed. Beneath it lies a history that has not been erased, but layered over, waiting without urgency to be uncovered. If something unfamiliar once occurred, something brief or subtle, its trace would not necessarily stand out against this vast backdrop of change. It might be buried, fragmented, or altered beyond recognition. It might exist in pieces too small or too scattered to form a clear picture. Or it might be there, intact, but deeply hidden, beyond the reach of current understanding. Time does not prioritize what is important. It treats all things equally, compressing them into the same silent record. What is preserved is not chosen for its significance, but by chance, by conditions that allow it to endure. This realization carries a quiet weight. It suggests that the absence of clear evidence may say more about our limitations than about what truly exists. That what has been lost to view may still be present, waiting in a form that has yet to be recognized. And as this possibility settles, the focus begins to shift once more. Because if the physical traces of the past can be buried so completely, if they can blend into the fabric of the earth until they are almost indistinguishable, then perhaps the most important traces are not those that remain fixed in place. Perhaps they are something else entirely, something that does not rely on preservation in stone or sediment, but continues in a different way, repeating, reappearing, carrying fragments of the past forward without ever needing to remain still. The search begins to change again, moving away from what can be held or uncovered, and towards something less fixed, less visible, but far more persistent. Patterns begin to take shape, not as isolated events, but as repetitions that stretch across time and distance. They do not remain in one place. They appear, disappear, and reappear, carrying a sense of continuity that feels difficult to ignore. Ancient structures, when observed closely, often align with movements in the sky. The position of the sun at specific times of the year, the shifting paths of stars, the rhythm of cycles that extend far beyond immediate human experience. These alignments are not random. They reflect intention, awareness, and a level of precision that suggests deep familiarity with patterns that repeat endlessly above. But these patterns are not limited to structures alone. Symbols emerge across cultures that never intersected, shapes and meanings that echo one another despite vast separation. Circular forms representing cycles, figures descending from above, recurring motifs that suggest connection rather than coincidence. These symbols change in detail, but something within them remains constant, as though shaped by a shared influence that does not rely on direct contact. Even developments within human societies seem to follow similar rhythms. Ideas appear in different regions at roughly the same time. Advancements unfold in parallel, without clear pathways of communication. It is as though certain moments in history align, creating openings where similar thoughts and innovations emerge simultaneously, guided by something not fully understood. These repetitions do not announce themselves as evidence. They do not stand apart in a way that demands explanation. Instead, they blend into the background, becoming part of what is accepted as natural progression. Yet when viewed together, they begin to form a structure of their own, something that exists not in physical form, but in the way events and ideas unfold. What if these patterns are more significant than the objects we search for? Artifacts can be lost, structures can erode, but patterns continue. They do not depend on preservation. They exist through repetition, through the quiet reappearance of forms that carry fragments of something older, something that does not need to remain fixed in order to persist. What if the evidence was never meant to stay still, but to repeat? The thought settles into the background, subtle but persistent. It does not require immediate acceptance. It simply shifts the way attention is directed, encouraging a focus on movement rather than stillness, on continuity rather than isolated discovery. Patterns do not explain themselves. They suggest, they hint, they invite connection without forcing it. And within that invitation lies a different kind of understanding, one that does not rely on clear proof, but on recognition. The moment when something familiar is seen in a new way, when repetition begins to feel intentional rather than accidental. It is in these moments that the mystery deepens, because patterns, once noticed, cannot easily be unseen. They create a sense of structure where none was previously recognized, a quiet awareness that something may be unfolding across time in a way that is not immediately visible. And yet, even as these patterns suggest continuity, they also raise a more difficult question. If something once shaped them, if there was an influence that set them into motion, then why does that influence no longer appear in a direct way? Why does it seem to exist only in echoes, in repetitions that continue without revealing their source? As this question begins to form, the story moves once again, shifting away from patterns themselves and toward the silence that surrounds them. Because if something did visit, if something left traces that continue to repeat, then the quiet absence that followed becomes just as important as the presence that came before. And within that absence, another possibility begins to take shape, one that suggests the departure itself may have been as intentional as the arrival. The story turns once more, not toward what was left behind, but toward what may never have been meant to remain. There is a quiet assumption that shapes the way the question is asked, an expectation that if something visited, it would have stayed, expanded, built, and left a clear mark upon the world. This expectation feels natural, because it reflects the way human presence unfolds. But it may not apply beyond that perspective. What if the nature of such a visit was entirely different? Instead of imagining arrival as the beginning of occupation, the possibility emerges that it was something far more limited. Not a settlement, not a transformation of the world, but a brief encounter, carefully contained. A presence that appeared, interacted in ways that were precise and controlled, and then departed without leaving anything that could easily be traced. This shifts the question in a subtle but important way. Evidence is often expected to reflect duration. The longer something remains, the more it leaves behind. Structures, tools, changes to the environment, all of these accumulate over time, but a short presence, especially one that avoids unnecessary impact, would not follow the same pattern. It might leave very little. The idea does not suggest absence of activity, only absence of permanence. A moment, even a significant one, can pass without leaving behind physical proof, especially when it is not intended to. Influence does not always require presence to endure. It can exist in what changes, not in what remains. There is a quiet clarity in this possibility. It removes the expectation of obvious evidence, allowing for something more subtle to take its place. A visit could have been purposeful, focused, directed toward a specific outcome rather than a lasting presence. It could have involved observation, limited interaction, or the sharing of knowledge in ways that did not disrupt the natural flow of development. If such an encounter occurred, it would not need to leave behind structures or artifacts to be significant. Its impact could exist within the direction it influenced, within the small shifts that altered the course of what followed. Over time, the origin of those shifts would fade, becoming indistinguishable from the natural progression of events. What if they were never here to stay, only to pass through? The question settles quietly, changing the way the absence of evidence is understood. It suggests that the lack of clear traces may not indicate that nothing happened, but that whatever did happen was never meant to leave a lasting imprint in the form we expect. This does not remove the mystery. It deepens it. Because intention begins to matter, if a presence is brief, controlled, and purposeful, then it raises a different kind of question. Not just whether something occurred, but why it occurred in that way. Why arrive only to leave? Why interact only enough to influence, but not enough to remain visible? The thought does not demand answers. It simply opens a space where the assumptions surrounding the question begin to shift. The focus moves away from what should have been left behind and toward what may have been intentionally avoided. In this space, the absence of evidence no longer feels like a barrier. It becomes part of the pattern itself, something shaped by choice rather than by chance. A quiet indication that whatever presence may have existed did not follow the paths that humans expect. And as this realization begins to settle, another question emerges, slower and more deliberate. Because if a visit was brief, if it was designed to leave minimal trace, then there must have been a reason for that restraint. Something that guided the decision not to remain, not to reveal, not to leave behind anything that could easily be found. And it is within that question that the story continues, moving toward a deeper understanding of what it might mean to arrive, and then choose, very carefully, to remain unseen. The idea begins quietly, almost unnoticed at first. It does not suggest that nothing is there, but that something may be present in a way that avoids recognition. Absence in this sense is not emptiness. It is the result of something that chooses not to be seen. There is a difference between not existing and not appearing. The two often feel the same, because human understanding relies heavily on visibility. What cannot be detected is often assumed not to be there. But this assumption depends on the idea that everything that exists should be accessible. That presence naturally reveals itself. What if that is not always true? In many systems, the ability to remain unnoticed requires effort, not passivity. It requires awareness, control, and intention. To move through an environment without leaving a trace is not the absence of activity, but the presence of precision. It suggests a level of understanding that goes beyond simple interaction, extending into the consequences of being observed. If something arrived with that level of awareness, it might not seek recognition. It might avoid it. The reason does not need to be complex. Interference changes outcomes. Even small interactions can alter the direction of development in ways that cannot be reversed. A presence that understands this might choose restraint, limiting its visibility to avoid creating effects that extend beyond its intention. This introduces a different kind of possibility, one that does not rely on disappearance, but on control. Not leaving because it cannot stay, but choosing not to remain in a visible form. Not because it lacks presence, but because presence itself carries consequences. The thought shifts the meaning of silence. What appears as emptiness may instead be a boundary, something maintained rather than imposed. A quiet separation between what is observed and what is not, shaped not by distance, but by choice. What if the reason we see nothing is because we were never meant to? The question does not arrive with urgency. It settles slowly, allowing space for the idea to unfold. It suggests that the lack of evidence may not be a failure of discovery, but the result of something that does not wish to be discovered in a direct way. This possibility moves the story into a more reflective space. It is no longer only about whether something happened, but about intention, about the decisions that shape how something appears, or chooses not to appear at all. Knowledge, in this sense, carries weight. The ability to influence without being seen, to observe without interfering, to remain present without becoming known. These are not passive states. They require understanding, and perhaps something more restraint. There is a quiet implication here, one that does not need to be stated directly. That advanced understanding may come with a recognition of limits, that the choice to remain unseen may not be avoidance, but responsibility. The idea does not resolve anything. It does not confirm presence, nor does it deny it. It simply reframes the silence, turning it from absence into something more deliberate, more structured, more intentional than it first appeared. And as this thought begins to settle, another question starts to form, slower and more difficult to ignore. Because if something chose to remain unseen, if its presence was controlled in a way that avoided recognition, then it raises a deeper uncertainty. Was that presence ever meant to be seen by us at all? The question lingers, quiet but persistent, shifting the perspective once again, because it suggests that the absence of visibility may not be about hiding from humanity, but about something else entirely. And it is here that the story begins to move toward a more unsettling possibility, one that places humanity not at the center of the encounter, but somewhere at its edge, observing something that may never have been directed toward it in the first place. The question begins to change, almost without notice. It has followed a familiar path so far, shaped by an assumption that feels natural, almost unavoidable. If something visited, then it must have come for us. For humanity, for the beings who would eventually ask the question itself. But what if that assumption is the one thing that has been guiding the search in the wrong direction? The thought does not arrive abruptly. It unfolds slowly, like a shift in focus rather than a sudden realization. It suggests that the center of attention may not have been where we believed it to be, that the presence, if it existed, may not have been directed toward humanity at all. Instead, it may have been directed towards something much older, the Earth itself. Long before cities, before language, before the structures and stories that define human history, the planet was already in motion. Its systems were forming, stabilizing, evolving in ways that would eventually make life possible. Oceans moved, atmospheres shifted, and conditions aligned in a balance that remains complex even now. What if that process was the focus? The idea does not diminish humanity. It simply places it within a larger context, one where human existence is part of a broader system rather than its central purpose. In this perspective, any visit would not have been about interaction with early humans, but about observation of the environment, the conditions, the potential that existed long before human awareness. Humanity, then, becomes something that emerged within that observed system, not the reason for the observation itself. This reframing carries a quiet weight. It does not challenge directly, but it alters the shape of the question. Because if the Earth was the focus, then the absence of direct evidence related to human interaction becomes less surprising. There would have been no need to leave messages, no reason to establish lasting presence, no intention to be recognized by something that had not yet fully formed. The presence, if it existed, would have been concerned with something else entirely. What if we were never the destination, only part of what was found here? The question settles into the background, subtle but persistent. It does not demand an answer. It simply opens a different way of seeing, one that shifts attention away from human-centered explanations and towards something broader, something less defined but more expansive. In this view, the patterns, the structures, the fragments of memory, and even the absence of evidence begin to align differently. They no longer need to point directly to humanity to hold meaning. They can exist as part of a larger interaction with the planet itself, one that humanity later became part of without fully understanding. This possibility does not resolve the mystery, it deepens it, because it suggests that the questions being asked may have been shaped by perspective rather than reality, that the search has been focused in a direction that feels intuitive but may not be complete. And as this idea begins to settle, it creates a quiet sense of expansion. The mystery grows larger, not smaller. It moves beyond the boundaries of human history and into something that feels less defined, less centered, but far more complex. If the Earth itself was the focus, then the implications extend beyond the past. They reach into the present, into the systems that continue to move, into the processes that have never stopped unfolding. And it is here that the story begins to shift once more. Because if attention was ever placed upon this planet, if something once observed, influenced, or passed through without leaving a clear trace, then the question is no longer limited to what happened long ago. It becomes something far more immediate. Are there still signs of that attention, not hidden in ancient history, but present now, woven into the patterns and signals that continue to surround us, waiting to be noticed in ways we have only just begun to understand. The story does not remain in the past. It does not stay buried in stone or hidden within fragments of memory. It continues, quietly, into the present, carried forward by a question that has never fully disappeared. The difference now is not the question itself, but the way it is asked. Where ancient civilizations looked to the sky with stories, modern humanity looks with instruments. The gaze remains the same, but the method has changed. Telescopes extend vision beyond what the eye can see. Signals are captured, measured, translated into patterns that can be studied and compared. The search has become more precise, more structured, yet it is driven by something familiar, something that echoes the same curiosity that once shaped myths and observations long ago. Across the world, there are quiet efforts to listen. Not in a dramatic way, not with expectation of immediate discovery, but with patience. Signals from distant space are recorded, analyzed, filtered through layers of interpretation. Most of them resolve into known phenomena, natural processes that follow predictable rules. But occasionally, something appears that does not fit so easily into those patterns. A signal that arrives without clear origin. A pattern that repeats just enough to be noticed, but not enough to be fully understood. These moments do not confirm anything. They do not provide answers. They simply remain, existing at the edge of explanation, waiting for further observation. They are often set aside, placed into categories that allow the search to continue without disruption. Unknown does not mean unexplainable, only not yet explained. And so the process moves forward, steady, methodical, grounded in the expectation that understanding will come with time. But there is something quietly familiar in this process. The act of searching itself begins to feel less like a new endeavor and more like a continuation. The tools have changed, the language has evolved, but the underlying motion remains the same. A reaching outward, a listening, a watching, a steady attention directed towards something that may or may not respond. What if the search we think is new has been answering something much older? The question settles gently, not as a conclusion, but as a reflection. It suggests that the modern search is not separate from the past, but connected to it in ways that are not immediately visible. That the curiosity driving scientific exploration may be part of a longer pattern, one that has existed long before the tools to measure it were developed. This idea does not change the nature of the search, it simply deepens it, because it introduces the possibility that what is being observed now may not be entirely new. That the signals, the anomalies, the quiet irregularities may not be isolated events, but echoes of something that has been present for far longer than we have been able to detect. The tone remains calm, grounded in observation rather than assumption. There is no need to claim that these signals represent anything specific. Their significance lies not in what they prove, but in what they suggest. That the boundary between known and unknown is not fixed, but constantly shifting, expanding as perception grows. And within that expansion, something begins to take shape. Not clearly, not fully, but enough to be felt. A sense that the search is not moving forward alone, but moving along a path that may have been set long before it was recognized. As this realization begins to settle, attention shifts once more. Because if signals can arrive from beyond, if patterns can emerge from distant sources, then the question naturally turns inward. What if similar signals exist closer than expected? Not in the depths of space, but here, within the systems that surround us every day, embedded in the environment itself, waiting not to be discovered, but to be noticed. The search does not always lead to clarity. Often, it leads into something far less defined, a field of information so dense and disordered that meaning becomes difficult to separate from randomness. Signals arrive mixed with interference, layered with natural processes, surrounded by fluctuations that seem to cancel one another out. At first glance, it appears as noise, something to be filtered, reduced, or ignored. But noise is not always empty. Within complex systems, patterns can exist in ways that are not immediately visible. They do not present themselves clearly, and they do not follow simple structures. Instead, they repeat in subtle ways, appearing just often enough to be noticed, but not enough to be easily confirmed. These patterns do not stand apart from the noise. They exist within it, woven into the same fabric that makes them difficult to recognize. In modern observation, this becomes especially apparent. Data collected from distant sources often contains irregularities, small deviations that resist easy classification. Most are eventually explained, understood as natural variations within larger systems. But some remain uncertain, not because they are impossible, but because they do not align with existing expectations. The tendency is to dismiss them, to assume that anything unclear must be incomplete or irrelevant. It is a practical approach, one that allows understanding to remain stable. But it also introduces a limitation, because recognition depends on expectation, and what is not expected is often overlooked. This raises a quieter question. What if meaning does not always appear in the way we are prepared to recognize it? The idea does not suggest that every anomaly carries significance. Most do not. But it does open the possibility that something subtle could exist within the noise, something structured in a way that does not match familiar patterns, something that requires a different kind of attention, one that does not filter too quickly, that allows uncertainty to remain long enough for recognition to emerge. In natural systems, this is not uncommon. Patterns appear in weather, in biological processes, in movements that seem chaotic until viewed from the right perspective. What once appeared random becomes structured, not because it changed, but because the way it was observed shifted. The same possibility extends beyond the natural world. If something were present in a subtle form, if influence or communication existed in a way that did not rely on clear signals, it would likely appear indistinguishable from noise at first. It would not stand out. It would blend in, repeating just enough to exist, but not enough to be immediately understood. What if the signal was never hidden, only mistaken for noise? The question settles, without urgency, allowing the idea to unfold gradually. It does not suggest that something is being missed intentionally, only that perception has limits. That recognition depends on patterns that are already known, and that unfamiliar structures may pass unnoticed simply because they do not match those patterns. This introduces a quiet tension, not of fear, but of possibility. The realization that something could be present without being recognized, not because it is concealed, but because it is integrated so completely into its surroundings that it becomes part of what is dismissed. It invites a slower form of observation, a willingness to sit with ambiguity rather than resolve it immediately, to notice repetition without forcing meaning, to allow patterns to emerge on their own terms rather than within predefined structures. And as this awareness begins to take hold, the search changes once again. It becomes less about finding something separate and more about recognizing something within what already exists. Because if patterns can exist within noise, if meaning can be present without being obvious, then the question is no longer only about what is out there. It becomes something more personal, more immediate. Are we capable of recognizing what we are looking for? And it is here that the story begins to turn inward again, shifting from the external world of signals and patterns toward the nature of perception itself, toward the quiet boundaries that define what can be seen and what remains just beyond awareness. The search, which once moved outward into the sky and downward into the earth, now turns toward something far more subtle. It turns toward the boundaries of perception itself, because every attempt to understand the unknown depends on what can be sensed, measured, and interpreted. And those abilities are not unlimited. They are shaped by the tools we use, the senses we rely on, and the expectations we carry. What is seen is never the whole picture. Human perception filters reality. The eyes capture only a narrow range of light. The ears respond to a limited band of sound. Even the most advanced instruments extend these ranges only in specific directions, revealing some aspects while leaving others untouched. What lies outside those boundaries does not disappear. It simply remains unnoticed. This introduces a quiet possibility. Not that something is hidden, but that it exists in a way that does not align with how we currently observe. Not invisible, but unrecognized. Present, but not interpreted. Throughout history, this has happened before. Phenomena that were once present went unnoticed for generations, not because they were absent, but because there was no framework to understand them. The patterns were there, the signals existed, but they did not fit within the limits of perception at the time. Only when those limits expanded did recognition become possible. The shift from not seeing to seeing does not change the phenomenon itself. It changes the observer. This realization begins to settle slowly, almost gently. It suggests that the mystery may not be entirely external, waiting somewhere beyond reach, but may exist at the edge of awareness, just beyond what is currently understood. Not distant, but close. Not unreachable, but unrecognized. What if it's not that nothing is there, but that we cannot yet see it? The question does not demand urgency. It invites reflection. It suggests that absence may be a matter of perception rather than reality. That what appears as emptiness may simply be something that has not yet been identified in a meaningful way. This does not imply that everything unknown hides something significant. Most things, once understood, become ordinary. But it does leave space for the possibility that something subtle could exist just beyond the boundary of current understanding, waiting not to be revealed, but to be recognized when perception shifts. And perception is not static, it evolves. New tools extend awareness. New ideas reshape interpretation. What once seemed impossible becomes measurable, then familiar. The unknown gradually becomes known, not because it changes, but because the ability to observe it improves. This creates a quiet tension within the search, because it suggests that the limitations are not only external, but internal. That what is being looked for may not be absent, but simply outside the current frame of reference. It becomes less a question of discovery and more a question of readiness. And as this thought begins to settle, the mystery deepens in a different way. It moves away from distant signals and buried traces, and towards something more immediate. Because if perception defines what can be found, then it also defines what can be missed. The boundary between known and unknown is not fixed. It shifts, slowly, as awareness expands. And within that shifting boundary lies a possibility that feels both distant and close at the same time. That something could exist within reach, within the world already observed, but just beyond the ability to fully recognize it. As this idea takes hold, the story prepares to move forward once again. Because if something once existed within these limits, if something passed through or influenced the world in ways that were not fully perceived, then the question is no longer confined to the past. It becomes something more immediate, more continuous. Could that influence still be present, shaping the course of events in ways that remain unseen, not because it is hidden, but because it exists just beyond the edge of what we are able to perceive? The question no longer rests on presence alone. It begins to consider something quieter, something that does not depend on being seen or even remembered. Influence, in its simplest form, does not require permanence. It does not require visibility. It only requires timing. In many systems, a small change introduced at the right moment can alter everything that follows. A slight adjustment at the beginning of a process can redirect its outcome entirely, even if the adjustment itself leaves no lasting trace. Once the system continues, it carries the effect forward, embedding it into its natural progression until the origin of that change becomes indistinguishable. This idea appears in nature often. A shift in conditions at a critical point can shape the development of an entire environment. A change in temperature, a variation in pressure, a difference in timing, each one capable of influencing the path that unfolds. The result feels natural, as though it could have happened on its own, and in many ways, it could. But the presence of that initial change remains, hidden within the outcome. What if the same principle applies to history? Not through force, not through direct intervention, but through moments of subtle direction, a suggestion rather than an instruction. An influence that aligns with existing conditions, guiding them slightly without disrupting the flow. The idea does not require a visible presence. It does not require structures or artifacts. It exists within the shift itself, within the difference between what might have happened and what did. Early human development presents moments that feel open to this possibility, points where knowledge appears, where direction changes, where progress accelerates in ways that seem both natural and unexpected. These moments do not stand apart as unnatural. They blend into the broader story, becoming part of what is accepted as organic growth. But what if some of these moments were not entirely self-contained? What if they were influenced, not in a way that replaces human effort, but in a way that shapes its direction? A nudge at the right time, a subtle alignment that allows existing potential to unfold differently. This does not diminish human capability. It exists within it. It suggests that development may not always be isolated, that it may occasionally intersect with influences that are not immediately recognized. What if history was not changed by force, but by quiet direction? The question carries a different kind of weight. It does not suggest control, but influence, not domination, but guidance. Something that does not impose itself, but adjusts what is already in motion. Such influence would be difficult to detect. It would not leave behind clear markers. It would exist within outcomes that feel entirely natural, embedded so deeply that separating cause from effect becomes nearly impossible. Over time, the origin of that influence would fade. What remains is the result, the path that was taken, the developments that followed. The subtle shift becomes part of the story, not as an external addition, but as something internal, something that belongs to the progression itself. This introduces a quiet unease, not of fear, but of realization. That history, as it is understood, may carry layers that are not immediately visible. That within the flow of events, there may be moments shaped by something that did not remain long enough to be noticed. And yet, this possibility does not disrupt the narrative. It integrates into it, becoming part of the complexity rather than standing outside it. As this idea begins to settle, another question naturally follows. Because if influence can exist without presence, if direction can be shaped without leaving a trace, then there is no reason to assume that such influence belongs only to the past. It could continue, quietly, without interruption, without recognition, shaping outcomes in ways that feel entirely natural, guiding without being seen, existing within the flow of events rather than outside them. And it is here that the story moves forward, toward a possibility that feels both subtle and profound. That what once may have occurred is not something that ended, but something that may still be unfolding, just beyond the edges of awareness. The idea of departure feels simple. Something arrives, something interacts, and then it leaves. The moment ends, the presence fades, and what remains is only memory or absence. This sequence feels natural, almost automatic, because it reflects how human experience is understood. But this assumption depends on a clear boundary between being present and being gone. What if that boundary is not as clear as it seems? Presence is often associated with visibility. To be present is to be seen, to be detected, to leave a trace that confirms existence. Absence, in contrast, is understood as the lack of these signs. But there is a quieter possibility, one that exists between these two states, where something may continue without appearing in a recognizable form. If something once existed in a way that influenced the world, it would not necessarily need to remain in that same form to continue existing. Influence can persist even when its origin is no longer visible. It can shift, adapt, and embed itself within systems that continue to operate long after the initial moment has passed. This does not require a physical presence. It does not require objects or structures that can be identified and measured. It exists within patterns, within processes, within the subtle ways in which systems evolve and interact. The thought moves slowly, unfolding without urgency. What if leaving did not mean disappearing? The question settles into the background, quiet but persistent. It does not suggest that something remains in a direct or observable way. Instead, it introduces the possibility that presence can take forms that do not align with expectation, that what appears to be absence may, in fact, be a continuation in a different state. In natural systems, continuity often exists without clear markers. A process begins, influences its environment, and then becomes part of that environment. Over time, the distinction between the origin and the result fades, leaving only the system itself, functioning as though it had always been that way. If something similar occurred on a larger scale, it would be difficult to recognize. The influence would not stand apart. It would be integrated, woven into the patterns that define the world. It would not announce itself, because there would be no clear boundary separating it from what already exists. This creates a subtle shift in perspective. The idea of a visit followed by departure begins to feel incomplete. Instead, it becomes possible to consider that what is described as departure may have been a transformation, a movement from one form of presence into another. Not visible, but not absent. Not active in a way that can be easily detected, but not entirely gone. The implication is not immediate. It unfolds gradually, creating a quiet tension between what is known and what may be possible. It suggests that the search for clear evidence may overlook forms of presence that do not present themselves in familiar ways. This does not confirm anything. It does not claim that such a presence exists. It simply expands the space in which the question can exist, allowing for possibilities that do not fit within traditional definitions. And within that expanded space, something begins to feel less certain. The silence that once seemed empty now carries a different quality. It no longer feels like the absence of something that was once there. It begins to feel like something that continues, but in a way that resists recognition. Presence and absence begin to overlap, no longer opposing each other, but existing within the same space, defined not by what can be seen, but by what can be perceived. This realization does not resolve the mystery. It deepens it. Because if something can exist without being visible, if it can continue without leaving clear traces, then the question is no longer limited to what happened in the past. It extends into the present. And as this thought begins to settle, the story moves towards something more personal. Because if presence can exist in this subtle, integrated way, then it raises a question that cannot be directed outward alone. What role does humanity play within this pattern? Not as observers, but as participants, existing within systems that may carry influences far older and far less visible than they appear. The story no longer rests at a distance. It does not remain something to observe from afar, something separate, contained within the past or hidden within distant systems. It begins to move closer, quietly, until the boundary between observer and subject becomes less certain. Up to this point, the question has been framed as something external, something that may have arrived, influenced, and departed, something to be discovered, examined, understood from the outside. But if influence can persist without visibility, if patterns can continue without clear origin, then the idea of standing apart from it begins to shift. Because humanity does not exist outside of these patterns. It exists within them. Every system that has been observed, every process that has been considered, includes human presence as part of its unfolding. The same cycles, the same patterns, the same subtle continuities that shape the world also shape the way humans think, act, and search for meaning. Curiosity itself becomes part of the pattern, not separate from it. This introduces a quieter, more personal possibility. What if the search is not something humanity is doing, but something humanity is part of? The question does not arrive with certainty. It moves slowly, allowing space for reflection. It suggests that the desire to understand, to explore, to reach beyond what is known, may not be entirely self-contained. That it may exist within a larger process, one that began long before recorded history and continues to unfold in ways that are not immediately visible. Human innovation, the sudden leaps in knowledge, the persistent drive to explore both the physical world and the abstract unknown, all of these begin to feel less isolated. They become part of a broader movement, something that extends beyond individual moments and connects across time. This does not diminish human agency. It does not remove the importance of human thought or achievement. Instead, it places them within a larger context, one where actions and discoveries are both independent and connected at the same time. The mystery begins to shift in tone. It is no longer something that exists entirely outside, waiting to be uncovered. It becomes something that is experienced, something that unfolds through participation rather than observation alone. The search itself becomes part of the phenomenon, not just a response to it. What if we are not just searching for the answer, but part of the answer itself? The idea settles with a quiet weight. It does not demand agreement. It simply invites a different way of seeing, one that allows for connection rather than separation, one that recognizes that the boundary between the known and the unknown may not be as distinct as it appears. Within this perspective, the past, the present, and the future begin to align differently. They are no longer separate points in time, but parts of a continuous process, each one influencing the other in ways that are not always clear. Humanity becomes part of that continuity, not as the center, but as a participant, moving within patterns that extend beyond immediate awareness. The search for meaning, the exploration of the unknown, the quiet persistence of curiosity, all of these become expressions of something larger, something that cannot be easily defined. The mystery remains unresolved, but it feels different now, less distant, less external, more integrated into the experience of being human. And as this realization begins to settle, the story prepares to move forward once again. Because if humanity exists within this unfolding pattern, if it is part of something that continues beyond what can be fully understood, then the question is no longer limited to what has already happened. It extends into what has yet to be revealed. What the future may bring, what may still emerge as perception expands, what may finally become visible when the limits that once defined understanding begin to shift. And it is there, at the edge of what is not yet known, that the story continues. The story begins to shift again, but this time the movement feels different. It is no longer about looking deeper into the past or further into the unknown. Instead, it carries a quiet sense of approach, as though something that has always been distant is beginning to move closer, not in space, but in understanding. There have been moments like this before. Questions that once seemed impossible have, over time, become part of accepted knowledge. Ideas that were dismissed, ignored, or quietly set aside have returned, reshaped by new perspectives, supported by observations that were once overlooked. What was once unthinkable becomes discussable, and what was discussable eventually becomes understood. This process is rarely sudden. It does not arrive as a single discovery or a dramatic revelation. It builds slowly, through small shifts that accumulate over time. A detail that does not fit, a pattern that repeats, a question that refuses to disappear. Each one on its own may seem insignificant, but together they begin to form something larger, something that cannot be easily dismissed. The question of ancient visitors may be moving through this same process, not as a claim, not as a conclusion, but as an idea that is gradually becoming more difficult to ignore. It no longer exists only at the edges of speculation. It appears in fragments, in discussions, in observations that align just enough to create a sense of direction. What once felt distant now feels closer, not because it has changed, but because the way it is being seen has begun to shift. This creates a subtle tension, a quiet sense that something is forming just beyond reach. Not fully visible, not yet defined, but present in a way that suggests it may soon move into clearer view. What if the question is no longer if, but when we begin to see it clearly? The thought does not arrive with urgency. It unfolds slowly, allowing space for reflection. It suggests that discovery is not an event, but a process. That understanding does not appear all at once, but emerges through a gradual alignment of perspective and observation. There is a kind of familiarity in this. The way the mind begins to recognize something before it can fully explain it. The way awareness shifts, not through certainty, but through accumulation. Each piece adding to a growing sense that something is there, waiting to be seen in a way that makes sense. This does not guarantee resolution. It does not promise that the question will be answered in a definitive way. But it does suggest that the conditions for recognition may be forming, slowly, quietly, without drawing attention to themselves. And within that formation, the search begins to feel different. Less like an attempt to uncover something hidden, and more like a process of becoming able to see what has always been present. The mystery does not move closer. Perception moves toward it. This shift carries a calm sense of anticipation, not of urgency or excitement, but of readiness. As though the question itself is reaching a point where it can no longer remain entirely unseen. And as this awareness begins to settle, attention naturally turns towards something more practical, something that shapes the way perception expands. Because if questions can become visible, if understanding can move closer without changing the reality itself, then the tools used to observe must play a role in that shift. The story begins to move in that direction, toward the instruments, the methods, and the technologies that extend human perception beyond its natural limits, exploring whether they may finally allow what has long remained just out of view to come into focus. The shift toward understanding has never depended on questions alone. It has always required a way to see, not just to look, but to observe beyond the limits of the human senses. Throughout history, each expansion of perception has revealed something that was already there, waiting without urgency, unchanged by the fact that it had not yet been noticed. The world has never been as simple as it appeared. When the first instruments extended vision into the sky, new layers of reality emerged. What once seemed like distant points of light became systems, movements, structures, far more complex than anyone had imagined. The sky did not change. Only the ability to see it did. The same pattern appears again and again. Microscopic observation revealed entire worlds hidden within what once seemed empty. Patterns in biology, invisible processes unfolding continuously, became visible only when the right lens was placed between the observer and the subject. These systems existed long before they were discovered. They did not wait to be created. They waited to be seen. Even in the realm of data, where patterns are not physical but abstract, the same principle holds. Information can exist in vast quantities, layered and complex, until the tools to process it reach a level where meaning begins to emerge. What once appeared as randomness begins to take shape, not because it changed, but because the ability to interpret it evolved. This introduces a quiet but important realization. The limitation has rarely been the absence of evidence. It has been the inability to detect it. What if the evidence has always been there, waiting for us to learn how to see it? The question settles into the flow of thought, not as a conclusion, but as a reflection. It suggests that what has been searched for may not be hidden in the way it was once imagined. It may exist just beyond the resolution of earlier tools, present but indistinguishable from the background until perception becomes precise enough to separate it. This does not imply that everything unknown is waiting to be discovered, but it does open the possibility that certain forms of evidence are subtle, existing at scales or in patterns that require specific methods to recognize. Not obvious, not immediate, but accessible once the right approach is applied. Modern technology continues to extend these boundaries. Observation reaches deeper into space, capturing signals that travel across unimaginable distances. Analysis reaches further into matter, revealing structures that were once beyond comprehension. Data processing uncovers patterns within complexity, allowing relationships to emerge where none were previously seen. Each advancement does not create new reality. It reveals what was already present. And within this process, something begins to take shape. Not clearly, not fully defined, but enough to suggest that the boundary between known and unknown is not fixed. It shifts with every new tool, every new method, every extension of perception. The idea that something could exist just beyond that boundary no longer feels distant. It becomes part of the natural progression of discovery. The question of ancient visitors, of subtle influences, of patterns that do not fully resolve, begins to align with this broader understanding. Not as something separate from science, but as something that may exist within its expanding reach, waiting for the conditions that allow recognition. The tone remains calm, grounded in observation rather than assumption. There is no need to claim that technology will provide answers, only that it changes the way questions are approached, and in doing so, alters what can be seen. And as perception sharpens, as the ability to detect subtle patterns improves, a new question begins to form. Because recognition changes everything. The moment something is seen clearly, it moves from possibility into understanding. It shifts from uncertainty into awareness. And that shift carries consequences, not only for what is known, but for how it is understood. So the question begins to take shape, quietly but inevitably. What happens if something is finally recognized? Not imagined, not interpreted, but seen in a way that leaves little room for uncertainty. What happens when the boundary shifts far enough that what once seemed hidden becomes visible, not through belief, but through perception itself? There is a moment that does not arrive all at once. It does not break through with certainty or announce itself with clarity. It builds quietly, almost imperceptibly, until it reaches a point where it can no longer be ignored. Not a discovery in the traditional sense, but something closer to recognition. It begins with small alignments. Fragments that once felt separate begin to connect. Patterns that seemed coincidental start to hold together with a quiet consistency. Questions that once felt speculative begin to feel grounded, not because they have been answered, but because they no longer seem impossible. Nothing dramatic happens. There is no single event that defines the shift. Instead, awareness changes gradually, like a horizon coming into focus as light increases. What was once unclear begins to take shape, not sharply, but enough to be noticed. The mind responds in stages. At first, there is hesitation, a quiet resistance to the idea that something long dismissed could hold weight. The instinct is to return to familiar explanations, to restore the comfort of what is already understood. But the alignment remains. It does not fade. Then curiosity begins to replace resistance. The possibility is no longer distant. It becomes something that can be considered without discomfort, something that invites attention rather than avoidance. The question is no longer fragile. It holds its place, steady and persistent. What if the truth doesn't arrive as a revelation, but as something we slowly realize we've always known? The thought moves gently through awareness, not forcing itself, but settling into place. It suggests that recognition may not feel like discovering something new, but like understanding something that was always present, just beyond clarity. There is a subtle shift in perception. The past begins to look different, not because it has changed, but because it is being seen through a different lens. The gaps in history, the patterns in stories, the anomalies that once felt isolated, all begin to align in a way that feels less fragmented. It is not certainty. It is something quieter, something more complex. A sense that the pieces fit, even if the full picture remains incomplete. The mind does not arrive at a conclusion. It arrives at a threshold. Emotion follows slowly. Not fear, not excitement, but a calm awareness that something significant may be unfolding. The weight of the possibility settles gently, without urgency. There is no need to resolve it immediately. It exists as a presence, something that can be held without being fully defined. This is the moment before understanding. The space where the question is no longer distant, but not yet fully answered. Where recognition has begun, but certainty has not arrived. It is a balance between knowing and not knowing, between clarity and ambiguity. And within that balance, something changes. The search is no longer about proving or disproving. It becomes about observing, about allowing the realization to take its natural shape. The pressure to define fades, replaced by a quiet willingness to see where the alignment leads. Nothing forces the conclusion. The moment remains open, suspended, allowing the mind to rest within it without needing to move forward too quickly. It is not incomplete. It is simply not finished. And as this state settles, as awareness adjusts to the presence of this emerging understanding, the story begins to move again. Because standing at the edge of realization changes the nature of the question. It is no longer only about what happened. It becomes about what it means. What follows when understanding begins to take shape, when the possibility shifts from distant to immediate, when the idea of something once hidden becomes part of the way the world is seen. And it is there, just beyond this moment of quiet recognition, that the next step begins to unfold. The moment of realization does not end the story. It changes it. What begins to unfold is not a conclusion, but a quiet expansion of perspective. The question is no longer centered on whether something happened, but on what it means if it did. And meaning has a way of reshaping everything around it, not by replacing what is known, but by placing it within a wider frame. Human identity has always been built on stories. Stories of origin, of development, of progression, from simplicity to complexity. These narratives create a sense of continuity, a structure that allows understanding to move from past to present with clarity. They define where humanity begins, how it grows, and what place it holds within the larger world. But every story is shaped by the boundaries of what is known at the time it is told. If those boundaries shift, even slightly, the story begins to change. A subtle confirmation that something once visited, something that existed outside the known flow of human development, would not erase history. It would not invalidate the path that humanity has taken. Instead, it would introduce a new layer, one that exists alongside what is already understood. The timeline would remain, but its context would expand. The emergence of knowledge, the patterns of development, the moments that once felt isolated, would begin to align within a broader framework. Not as contradictions, but as additions. Elements that deepen the narrative, rather than disrupt it. This shift is not dramatic. It does not create immediate upheaval or demand sudden acceptance. It unfolds slowly, allowing the mind to adjust to a wider view. The sense of isolation begins to soften, replaced by a quieter awareness that humanity may not exist as a closed system, separate from everything beyond it. What happens to our story when we realize it was never entirely our own? The question moves gently through thought, not as a challenge, but as an invitation. It suggests that identity is not fixed, that it can expand without losing its foundation. That understanding where humanity comes from does not require rejecting what is known, but allowing it to exist within something larger. There is a calmness in this realization, the idea that connection does not diminish individuality, but enriches it. That being part of a larger reality does not remove meaning, but adds to it. The boundaries that once defined understanding begin to feel less rigid, more open, allowing new possibilities to exist without conflict. The universe, once viewed as distant and separate, begins to feel closer, not in physical distance, but in relevance. The processes that shape it, the patterns that move through it, begin to align with the patterns observed on Earth, creating a sense of continuity rather than separation. Humanity becomes part of that continuity, not as an isolated point, but as something connected, something that exists within a network of processes that extend far beyond immediate awareness. The search for meaning, the drive to understand, the quiet persistence of curiosity, all begin to feel like expressions of that connection rather than independent traits. This does not answer the question. It reframes it. The focus shifts from proving existence to understanding relationship, from asking whether something happened to considering how it fits into the broader structure of reality. And as this perspective continues to expand, another layer begins to emerge. Because understanding is not only intellectual, it carries emotional weight, shaping how the idea is received, how it is processed, how it is integrated into the way people see themselves and the world around them. The story moves gently in that direction, toward the space between fear and curiosity, where new understanding is not only recognized, but felt. The shift in understanding does not remain purely intellectual. It moves into something deeper, something that cannot be measured or explained as easily. It becomes emotional, because every idea that expands perception also challenges it, and within that challenge, there is always a response. Two forces begin to emerge, quiet but undeniable: fear and curiosity. They do not oppose each other completely. They exist together, moving in balance, shaping the way the unknown is received. When something unfamiliar appears, something that does not fit within what is already understood, the first reaction is often uncertainty. A pause, a hesitation, a moment where the mind attempts to return to what feels stable. Fear does not always announce itself loudly. It can appear as doubt, as resistance, as a quiet reluctance to move beyond familiar boundaries. It asks questions that seek to protect what is already known. It looks for reasons to dismiss, to explain away, to restore clarity where uncertainty begins to grow. But alongside it, something else begins to take shape. Curiosity. A quieter force, but just as persistent. It does not resist the unknown. It moves toward it. It asks different questions, not to close the gap, but to explore it. Where fear seeks stability, curiosity seeks understanding. Throughout history, these two responses have always existed together. When the shape of the world was first questioned, there was resistance, but also wonder. When the nature of the sky began to unfold, there was uncertainty, but also fascination. Every expansion of knowledge has carried this dual response, a balance between holding on and reaching forward. The idea of ancient visitors would follow the same pattern. It would not be received in a single way. For some, it would challenge deeply held beliefs, creating a sense of instability that invites caution. For others, it would open new possibilities, expanding the way the world is understood. Would we be afraid of the unknown, or drawn toward it? The question does not demand a single answer. It reflects the complexity of the response itself, because both reactions can exist at the same time, even within the same person. Fear and curiosity do not cancel each other out. They interact, shaping the way understanding unfolds. As awareness grows, fear often begins to change. It does not disappear immediately, but it softens. What was once unfamiliar becomes less threatening as it is explored. The unknown begins to take shape, not fully, but enough to reduce the sense of uncertainty that first defined it. Curiosity, in contrast, tends to deepen. The more that is understood, the more questions emerge. Each answer leads to something further, something that extends beyond the original inquiry. It creates a movement that continues forward, not driven by the need for closure, but by the desire to understand. This balance creates a natural progression, from uncertainty to awareness, to exploration, not as a linear path, but as a gradual shift in emphasis. Fear becomes less dominant, curiosity more present, until the unknown no longer feels like something to avoid, but something to engage with. The idea settles into a calmer space. It no longer carries the weight of disruption. It becomes part of a broader understanding, something that can exist alongside what is already known without creating conflict. And within this balance, a deeper realization begins to form. Because the question is no longer only about the presence of something unknown. It becomes about what that presence means, not just for knowledge, but for existence itself. What does it reveal about the nature of reality? What does it suggest about the place humanity holds within it? As fear gives way to curiosity, the focus begins to shift once more, moving beyond reaction and toward reflection, toward the deeper layer beneath the question itself, where the search is no longer about what is out there, but about what it all reveals when seen from a wider perspective. The story begins to quiet, not because it has reached an end, but because it has reached something deeper. The surface question, the one that has guided the search so far, begins to soften. It does not disappear, but it loses its urgency, making space for something more fundamental to emerge. Why does this question matter so much? It has followed humanity across time, appearing in different forms, shaped by different cultures, expressed through different languages. The details change, but the underlying curiosity remains. A constant reaching beyond what is known, a quiet refusal to accept that understanding ends at the edge of perception. The idea of ancient visitors seems, at first, to be about the past, about whether something arrived, interacted, and left. But beneath that, there is something else. Something that does not depend on evidence or confirmation. A deeper need to understand connection. Where we come from. How we became what we are. Whether we exist alone or as part of something larger. These questions do not belong to a single moment in history. They are continuous, present in every attempt to understand the world and our place within it. What if the real mystery was never them, but us? The question does not arrive as a conclusion. It unfolds slowly, almost quietly, inviting reflection rather than response. It suggests that the search itself may reveal more about the one who is searching than about what is being sought. Every interpretation, every theory, every question carries the imprint of human thought. The way patterns are recognized, the way meaning is assigned, the way uncertainty is approached, all of it reflects something internal as much as something external. The mystery becomes a mirror, not a reflection of a single answer, but of the process of seeking itself. The curiosity, the doubt, the willingness to explore beyond the familiar, these are not responses to the unknown alone. They are part of what defines human nature. There is a quiet persistence in this, a sense that the search does not end because it is not meant to end. It continues, not because the answer remains hidden, but because the act of searching carries its own meaning. It shapes understanding, expands perception, and creates new questions that extend beyond the original inquiry. This does not diminish the possibility of discovery. It deepens it, because it suggests that whatever is found, whatever understanding emerges, will not stand apart from the one who finds it. It will be interpreted, integrated, shaped by the same curiosity that led to its discovery. The boundary between the question and the questioner begins to blur. The unknown is no longer something separate. It becomes part of the process of thought itself, something that evolves alongside understanding rather than existing outside of it. The tone settles into stillness. There is no need to resolve the question, no need to define it completely. It exists as it is, open, expansive, allowing space for thought to move without pressure. And within that space, something becomes clear. The search is not only about finding something external, it is about exploring the nature of understanding itself, about recognizing that the drive to know, to connect, to reach beyond what is immediately visible, is part of something deeper than the question alone. As this realization settles, the story begins to shift once more. Because if the question reflects something within, if the search reveals as much about humanity as it does about the unknown, then it raises another possibility. That the act of searching may not only reveal answers, but shape them. And it is here that the story moves forward, toward the idea that the way humanity looks for understanding may influence what is ultimately discovered in ways that are not yet fully understood. The story turns once more, not outward, but toward the act of searching itself. Until now, the question has followed a familiar direction, moving through history, through patterns, through perception, always looking for something that exists independently of the observer. But there is another possibility, quieter, more subtle, and far more difficult to separate from the search itself. That observation is not passive. The act of looking does not simply reveal what is there. It shapes what is noticed, what is recognized, and what is understood. Every question directs attention. Every expectation filters what is seen. The observer is not separate from the process. The observer is part of it. This idea appears in many forms, not only in science, but in perception itself. What the mind expects to find often determines what it becomes capable of seeing. Patterns that align with existing beliefs are recognized quickly, while those that do not may pass unnoticed, not because they are absent, but because they do not fit within the framework of interpretation. This does not mean that reality changes. It means that access to it does. What if the answer changes, depending on how we choose to look for it? The question does not suggest that truth is unstable. It suggests that the path to it is shaped by perspective, that the way a question is asked influences the kind of answer that becomes visible. If the search for ancient visitors is guided by expectations of physical evidence, then attention focuses on objects, structures, and direct traces. If those are not found, the conclusion may lean toward absence. But if the search expands to include patterns, influence, and subtle continuity, then different forms of evidence begin to emerge. The observer does not create the phenomenon, but the observer defines the lens through which it is perceived. This introduces a dynamic relationship between the search and what is being searched for. Not a fixed path, but an interaction. A movement where observation and reality influence each other in ways that are not always obvious. The mystery, in this sense, is not entirely separate from the one who observes it. It is shaped, at least in part, by the way it is approached. This realization unfolds slowly, without urgency. It does not challenge the existence of an objective truth. It simply acknowledges that understanding that truth depends on perspective, on interpretation, on the ability to recognize what is being observed. The implications are quiet, but significant, because it suggests that the search itself is not neutral, that every question carries direction, every method carries limitation, and every expectation carries influence. The outcome is not predetermined, but it is guided by the way the process unfolds. This does not weaken the search. It deepens it. It allows for a broader awareness, one that considers not only what is being looked for, but how it is being looked for. It invites a form of observation that is more open, more flexible, more willing to recognize possibilities that do not fit within familiar patterns. And as this awareness begins to settle, the boundary between observer and mystery becomes less distinct. The question is no longer entirely external. It becomes part of the process of thought itself, something that evolves as perception evolves. The search, then, is not just a path toward an answer. It is part of the answer. And this leads to another question, one that moves even deeper into the nature of the mystery. Because if observation shapes what is found, if the search influences the outcome, then it raises a possibility that extends beyond individual perception. That the search itself may not be random. That it may be part of a larger process, something that guides attention, shapes curiosity, and moves understanding in directions that are not entirely self-determined. And it is here that the story continues, moving toward the idea that the question itself, the act of searching, may have a structure that extends beyond what is immediately visible. The question does not remain still. It moves. It appears in one time, fades into the background, and then returns again in another, shaped differently but carrying something familiar beneath its surface. It does not follow a straight path, and yet it never fully disappears. Across generations, across cultures, across changes in knowledge and belief, it continues to re-emerge, as though it belongs to something deeper than any single moment. This is not unusual. Certain ideas persist. They shift in language, adapt to new understanding, and take on different forms, yet they remain present in a way that feels continuous. Questions about origin, connection, and the possibility of something beyond immediate experience have always existed. They are not confined to a specific place or time. They move with humanity, changing shape, but not losing their presence. The question of ancient visitors follows this pattern. It does not remain fixed in a single narrative. In one era, it appears as myth. In another, as speculation. In another, as a subject of quiet investigation. Each time it surfaces, it aligns with the context of its moment, shaped by the tools, language, and understanding available at the time. And yet, beneath those changes, something remains consistent. The direction of the question itself. It points outward, beyond what is known, while at the same time reflecting something inward, something connected to the way humans seek understanding. It is not forced. It arises naturally, as though it belongs to the structure of thought itself. What if this question was never accidental, but something we were always meant to ask? The idea does not suggest design in a rigid sense. It does not imply that the question has a predetermined answer or that it follows a fixed path. Instead, it introduces the possibility that certain questions carry a kind of momentum, one that allows them to persist, to resurface, to guide attention in subtle ways. This momentum is not always visible. It exists in the way ideas return, in the way curiosity moves, in the way certain thoughts feel familiar, even when encountered for the first time. It suggests that the search may not begin from nothing each time, but may continue from where it once paused, carried forward through memory, culture, and perception. This creates a quiet sense of continuity. The search for understanding becomes less like a series of separate attempts and more like a single process unfolding across time. Each generation contributes to it, not by starting over, but by continuing from where previous understanding left off, even if that connection is not consciously recognized. The question then begins to feel less like a random curiosity and more like part of a larger movement. Not something imposed, but something that emerges naturally, guided by conditions that allow it to take shape. When understanding reaches a certain point, when perception expands in specific ways, the question rises again, as though it has been waiting for that moment. This does not confirm intention. It does not suggest that the question originates from something external or that it is directed by a specific force. But it does allow for the possibility that curiosity itself may follow patterns, that it may be influenced by structures that extend beyond individual awareness. The tone remains quiet, reflective, allowing the idea to settle without force. Because the significance of this possibility does not lie in proving it, but in considering what it implies. That the search may not be entirely self-directed. That the questions asked may be shaped by conditions that exist beyond immediate perception. And within that thought, something begins to shift again. Because if the question itself carries momentum, if it continues to guide attention across time, then it becomes more than a simple inquiry. It becomes part of the process through which understanding unfolds. The mystery, then, is not only in what is being searched for, it is in the search itself. And as this realization begins to settle, the story moves closer to its most intimate level. Because if the question reflects something larger, something that persists beyond individual thought, then it also reflects something deeply human. Something about the way people think, the way they wonder, the way they continue to reach beyond what is known. And it is here that the focus turns inward once more, toward the nature of that curiosity itself, and what it reveals about the one who asks the question. The story turns inward completely now, no longer searching for something beyond, but looking quietly at what the search itself reveals. The question that has guided everything so far begins to soften, not because it has been answered, but because its deeper meaning starts to emerge. Every question carries something within it. Not just curiosity, but perspective. The way a question is formed reflects the one who asks it. It carries assumptions, expectations, and the desire to understand something that feels just out of reach. The search for ancient visitors is no different. It is not only about what may exist beyond Earth, but about the way humanity reaches toward that possibility. What if the answers we seek are also revealing who we are? The thought settles gently, not as a conclusion, but as a reflection. It suggests that the mystery is not only external, something waiting to be uncovered, but internal, something that unfolds within the act of searching itself. Every theory that has been formed, Every pattern that has been noticed, every interpretation that has been considered, all carry traces of human thought. The way connections are made, the way meaning is assigned, the way uncertainty is approached, all reflect something deeper than the question alone. The search becomes a mirror, not a reflection of a single answer, but of the process of understanding. It reveals curiosity, the drive to explore beyond what is known. It reveals imagination, the ability to consider possibilities that are not immediately visible. And it reveals something quieter, something that persists even when answers remain out of reach. A need to understand origins, to know where we come from, how we fit into the larger structure of existence, whether we stand alone or as part of something greater. These questions extend far beyond the idea of ancient visitors. They exist within every attempt to make sense of the world. And in that sense, the mystery begins to change. It is no longer only about discovering something outside of humanity. It becomes a way of understanding humanity itself. The patterns that are seen, the connections that are made, the meaning that is drawn from them, all reflect the way the human mind moves through uncertainty. This does not diminish the possibility of something beyond. It gives it context. Because whatever is discovered, whatever understanding eventually takes shape, it will always be filtered through human perception. It will be interpreted, shaped, and integrated into the existing framework of thought. The unknown, then, is not entirely separate. It exists in relation to the one who observes it. This creates a quiet sense of closure, not because the question has been resolved, but because its nature has been understood more deeply. The search is no longer only about finding something. It is about recognizing what the search itself reveals. There is calm in this realization, a sense that the need to reach beyond what is known is not something to be resolved, but something to be experienced. That the mystery does not need to be solved to hold meaning. It exists as part of the process, part of the way understanding unfolds. And as this awareness settles, the story begins to move toward its final phase. Because when the focus turns fully inward, when the question becomes less about answers and more about understanding, something shifts. The need for resolution begins to fade, replaced by something quieter. Acceptance, not of a specific answer, but of the mystery itself. The story returns to where it began, but it does not feel the same. At first, absence seemed like a gap, something incomplete, something that needed to be filled. It carried the weight of uncertainty, the sense that something was missing, waiting to be found. But now, after everything that has been explored, that absence begins to take on a different quality. It no longer feels empty. It feels present in its own way, shaped by the questions that surround it, by the patterns that move through it, by the quiet persistence of something that cannot be easily defined. The silence remains, but it is no longer silent in the way it once seemed. What if the silence was never empty, but full of something we are still learning to understand? The question does not seek an answer. It settles into the space that has been created, allowing the absence to be experienced rather than resolved. It suggests that not all meaning comes from clarity, that understanding does not always require complete definition. Throughout the journey, the search moved through layers of possibility, from missing records, to repeating stories, to patterns in the world and within perception itself. Each step brought something into view, not as a final answer, but as a deeper awareness of how the question exists. And now, in this final return to absence, those layers remain. They do not disappear. They become part of the silence, shaping it, giving it depth. What once felt like a void now feels like something that holds potential, something that carries meaning without needing to reveal itself completely. There is a quiet acceptance in this. The realization that not all truths are meant to be fully uncovered, at least not in the way they are often expected to be. That some forms of understanding exist in the space between knowing and not knowing, in the balance between clarity and mystery. This does not diminish the importance of the search. It transforms it. The search is no longer driven by the need to eliminate uncertainty, but by the ability to move within it. To recognize that the unknown is not an obstacle, but a part of the process of understanding. That questions can guide without being answered. That silence can speak without being broken. The absence, then, becomes something active. Not a lack, but a presence that invites reflection. A space where thought can move freely, where meaning can emerge without being fixed. It allows the mind to rest within the question, rather than pushing beyond it too quickly. There is a calmness here, a stillness that does not feel empty, but complete in its own way. The mystery remains, but it no longer feels distant. It feels integrated, part of the way the world is experienced, rather than something separate from it. It does not need to be resolved to hold value. It exists as it is, open, expansive, allowing understanding to continue without forcing it to end. And within this space, something becomes clear. The absence that once felt like the beginning of the search now feels like part of its continuation. Not a starting point that leads to an answer, but a condition that remains, shaping the journey without defining its conclusion. As this awareness settles, the story begins to move again, gently, without urgency. Because if absence itself can carry meaning, if silence can hold presence, then the idea of an ending begins to fade. The story does not close. It continues, not as a question waiting to be answered, but as something that unfolds, quietly, within the space that remains. The sense of an ending begins to dissolve. Not because the story has reached its limit, but because the idea of a final conclusion no longer fits the shape of what has been explored. The question that guided everything does not close. It remains open, not incomplete, but evolving. There are stories that move toward resolution, that gather their meaning into a single point and settle there. But there are others that continue, not because they lack an answer, but because their meaning changes over time. They unfold differently depending on how they are seen, shaped by perspective rather than confined by conclusion. This feels like one of those stories. The possibility of ancient visitors, the patterns, the silence, the shifting perception, none of it demands a final answer to remain meaningful. In fact, the absence of a fixed conclusion allows it to exist in a way that remains active, something that continues to move alongside human understanding. What if the story was never meant to end, only to continue being rediscovered? The question carries a quiet sense of continuity. It suggests that the search itself is not bound to a single moment, but stretches across time, changing as perception changes. Each generation encounters it differently, shaped by the knowledge, tools, and ideas available to them. What was once myth becomes inquiry. What was once dismissed becomes reconsidered. What feels impossible in one moment becomes possible in another. The story does not repeat exactly. It transforms, adapting to the way it is understood. This transformation does not weaken it. It keeps it alive. A story that ends becomes fixed. It no longer changes, no longer grows. But a story that continues remains part of the present, something that can be engaged with rather than simply remembered. The mystery of ancient visitors exists in this way. It is not something that belongs entirely to the past. It is something that moves forward, carried by curiosity, shaped by new ways of seeing. It exists in the questions that continue to be asked, in the patterns that continue to be noticed, in the quiet awareness that something remains just beyond complete understanding. There is a kind of calm in this realization. The need for a final answer begins to soften, replaced by an appreciation for the process itself. The story does not need to resolve in order to hold meaning. It exists as part of a larger unfolding, something that continues to reveal itself in different ways over time. Each perspective adds to it. Each observation reshapes it. Each question carries it forward. The idea of discovery changes as well. It is no longer a single moment of revelation, but a series of recognitions, small shifts in understanding that build gradually. The story becomes something that is experienced rather than concluded, something that unfolds rather than finishes. And within this unfolding, the mystery remains intact, not as something hidden, but as something that cannot be fully contained within a single explanation. It extends beyond any one answer, not because it is unreachable, but because it is larger than the framework used to define it. The story continues, not in a straight line, but in cycles, returning in different forms, each time offering a new perspective. This does not create uncertainty. It creates depth, because meaning is not confined to what is known. It exists in the space where understanding continues to expand, where the question remains open enough to allow new insights to emerge. And as this awareness settles, the movement of the story begins to slow, not toward an ending, but toward something quieter. A final reflection, not of resolution, but of presence. Because what remains is not a conclusion, but a feeling, something that lingers beyond the words themselves, something that continues even when the story appears to fade. The story does not end. It softens. It becomes quieter, less defined, as though it is no longer trying to move forward, but simply remaining where it has always been. The questions that once guided each step begin to loosen, not because they have been answered, but because they no longer need to be held so tightly. The earth continues. It turns without pause, carrying everything with it, just as it has always done. The surface shifts in ways that are rarely noticed. The atmosphere moves, the oceans rise and fall, and the same patterns that shaped the earliest moments of the planet remain in motion, unchanged in their presence, yet never the same from one moment to the next. The sky remains. Stars move across distances that do not require observation to exist. Light travels, silent and uninterrupted, carrying with it the same quiet continuity that has always defined the space beyond the Earth. Nothing announces this movement, nothing marks its importance, and yet it continues. What if nothing has changed, and everything is still quietly continuing? The question does not ask for an answer. It rests within the stillness, allowing the idea to settle without resistance. It suggests that the mystery was never something separate, never something that began or ended at a specific point in time. It has always been part of the flow. The same processes that may have shaped the earliest conditions, the same patterns that may have guided development, the same subtle influences that have been considered throughout the story, do not belong only to the past. They continue, quietly, without interruption. Nothing has stopped. Nothing has concluded. The difference is not in what exists, but in how it is seen. The search, once driven by the need to find, begins to shift into something else. A quiet awareness, a recognition that the mystery does not need to be pursued in order to be present. It exists within the world as it is, within the movement of time, within the patterns that repeat without drawing attention to themselves. There is a calmness in this realization. The urgency fades. The need for resolution softens. What remains is not a question waiting to be answered, but a presence that can be carried, something that exists in the background of thought without needing to be defined. The idea lingers, not as a problem to solve, but as something to consider, something to return to in quiet moments. It does not demand focus. It does not require effort. It simply remains, part of the way the world is experienced once it has been noticed. The story becomes part of that experience. Not separate from it, not contained within it, but woven into the way perception moves through the world. The earth, the sky, the patterns, the silence, all of it continues as it always has, unchanged in its presence, yet never repeating in exactly the same way. And within that continuation, the mystery remains. Not hidden, not revealed, but present in a way that does not require resolution. There is no final answer. There is no ending. Only the quiet continuation of something that has always been there, moving alongside everything else, waiting not to be discovered, but to be recognized in the moments when attention becomes still. And as the story fades into that stillness, it does not disappear. It remains, gently, within thought, within awareness, within the quiet space where questions do not need to be answered to hold meaning.